Smiling sadly, Natalia began to look through the album with her daughter's photographs. She saw Julia when she was less than 1 year old. The girl was in such a rush. She started walking when she was 9 months old. She didn't even walk. She ran as fast as she could, and she never stopped running. She had so many bruises as a child. Natalia spent so much time saying to her daughter, "Heal, heal, little frog butt. If you don't heal today, you will heal tomorrow." Julia always worried about the frog more than about herself. There were lots of her daughter's school photos. Her first celebratory assembly, primary school. Julia was very serious in those photos, but closer to high school, her daughter decided she should look the best in photographs. Julia couldn't change the uniform and bows because her mother was a teacher, so she tried to distinguish herself from everyone else in another way. She would either smile into the camera when other classmates remained serious, or pose half-turned. Smarty pants. And there were her student photos. Of course, there were fewer of them. Natalia suspected her daughter didn't share all of them with her. But what could she do? Julia was already an adult. She had her own life. Natalia sighed, closed the album, and thought, her daughter grew up. It all flashed by so quickly. The woman raised her daughter alone. In her final year of education, she realized she was pregnant. Natalia told her boyfriend about it, but he disappeared in a split second. Natalia had no other way but to return to her native village with a diploma of higher education and a pregnant belly. Her mom accepted and understood her. People talked a little and calmed down. When Julia grew older, Natalia went to work at school. They offered her a position as a primary school teacher. Natalia had been working there all her life. Her mother died several years ago. Her daughter grew up and moved to the city to study. She entered a prestigious university, the Faculty of Foreign Languages. After graduating, she got a job as a translator in a large company. She bought a small apartment and a car. How proud Natalia was of her daughter. She didn't even regret being single and hadn't met a man who would warm her heart and accept her child. The main thing was that Julia was happy. That was all Natalia prayed for. And then, Julia called and shocked her mother. She said she was getting married, not to an ordinary guy, but to a foreigner. She met John at work. He came to Russia from the United States to conclude a contract with the company where Julia worked. Their love affair developed quickly. They were already living together. John was in no hurry to return to his homeland and proposed to Julia. Julia agreed to marry him and move with her husband to his native country. Natalia was upset that her only child would live so far away. When would they meet again? Julia laughed. She said she visited her native village once a year at best. Therefore, nothing would change much. However, she showed John to her mother. They came over one weekend. He seemed to be a worthy young man, courteous and attentive, but he could hardly understand anything in Russian. They spoke English with Julia, and John tried speaking Russian with her mother. Natalia found it funny to listen to how he mangled words, but she didn't show it. She patiently helped her future son-in-law find the appropriate phrase. It seemed like they had a good conversation. Natalia asked the young couple about their wedding, but they just waved their hands. They said it was a relic of the past. They wanted only to get married at a registry office. And so they did. Natalia was sad. She didn't wear a wedding dress, and neither did her daughter. But the main thing was, she was happy. It all seemed to be okay. Julia often called her mother and talked about work and family life. And recently, she reported that John's sister, also from the United States, came to live with them. Natalia was surprised. How did they all fit in Julia's small studio? And her daughter just laughed. The more, the merrier. Samantha only came for a few weeks. She would fly away soon, and in a month or two, Julia and John would follow her. For some reason, her mother's heart sank then. It was not only from the imminent long separation from her daughter. There was something else, some inexplicable anxiety. However, Natalia couldn't understand what was bothering her so much. A week passed. One evening, Natalia was waiting for the usual call from her daughter, but the phone was silent. And then, Natalia called Julia herself. John picked up the phone. He muttered Russian words, trying to explain that Julia was sick and would call back later. Natalia didn't even have time to ask what happened before he cut off communication. Natalia hardly slept that night. She decided to take a few days off from work at her own expense and go to the city to visit her daughter. Of course, the school director would be unhappy she left in the middle of the school year, but Natalia felt her daughter needed her. In the morning, some unknown number called her. At first, Natalia couldn't understand what they were telling her about some viral infection and someone's death. No, that couldn't happen. That was a mistake. Her daughter was alive. She sat down, stunned by the news. Short beeps were coming from her cell phone. The poor woman looked lost at her device and pressed the end call button. Tears flowed from her eyes. Natalia fell face down on the floor and howled like a wounded wolf. The phone rang again. Natalia grabbed it and pressed the call button, hoping it was her daughter. She was alive. That was someone's cruel joke. It was John. He was worried and said Julia was in the morgue. In the evening, they would hand out the coffin. Natalia had to decide where to bury her daughter, in the city cemetery or the village. In the village, Natalia said, barely restraining herself from crying again, "I will pay all expenses." But John said he would pay for everything himself. Natalia only needed to resolve the issue with the grave. He spoke calmly, even businesslike. Natalia felt uneasy. She caught herself wondering, did John even love Julia? She burst into tears again. Her neighbor looked in. She heard Natalia crying through the open window. Having learned everything, Tatiana gasped and began to console the poor mother. After that, she said she would immediately call the funeral home in the regional center. Soon gravediggers arrived in the village. Natalia's neighbors began to arrange the funeral. Everyone was shocked. How could it happen? A young, beautiful, healthy woman suddenly died from some virus. Well, there it was. Many people died from it. Who knew it would take Julia too? Natalia was beside herself with grief. The day was over, the evening came, and then it was night. Her neighbors didn't leave her alone. They tried to console and support the poor woman. But was it possible to ease the pain of a mother who lost her child? In the morning, they brought the coffin. Those accompanying it noted gloomily it was forbidden to open the coffin due to safety rules, and it was better not to take it into the house. "Let it stand in the yard," they said. Natalia didn't want to hear them. She was still eager to open the coffin and see her daughter, and only her neighbors could somehow dissuade her. They placed the coffin with the body on stools in the yard under the apple tree that Julia planted as a child. It was late autumn outside, and a piercing wind was blowing. Almost all the residents of the village came to say goodbye to Julia. They all knew her. She grew up before their eyes. It all was so unexpected. Natalia, who had turned black for 24 hours from grief, was almost lying on the coffin and hugging it, and no one could take her away. Confused, John sat near her on a chair, with some unknown blonde sitting nearby. From her accent, they all knew she was also a foreigner. It was Samantha, John's sister, as he introduced her to the villagers. The girl was pale, even a little scared. That was probably her first time at a funeral. About half an hour later, John began glancing at his watch. He walked away from the coffin to the funeral service workers and nodded to them that it was time to take the coffin to the cemetery. "No, I won't give it." Natalia started screaming and grabbed the coffin. Her neighbors forcibly took her away from the coffin. The guys from the funeral service set about their work. Soon, the coffin with wreaths was in a hearse. A funeral procession followed. The heartbreaking cry of the grieving mother rushed through the village. Everyone who knew Julia couldn't hide their tears. John was the only one who didn't cry. Stone-faced, he walked behind the hearse, holding his sister by the hand. Samantha wiped away rare tears. People whispered among themselves, "Is she his sister? See how she's holding this dandy's hand?" Those were just idle speculations. Both John and Samantha behaved quite decently. They also looked worried about what was happening. It was unbearably cold in the cemetery. Everyone wrapped themselves in scarves and hats against the freezing wind. It also started to rain and snow. Those accompanying Julia on her last journey were cold and mentally and physically exhausted. They all breathed a sigh of relief when the coffin lowered into the grave and the gravediggers set about their work. Only her mother was standing nearby, not feeling the cold. She didn't feel anything at all. To support his mother-in-law, John didn't hurry up to leave. Samantha stood patiently nearby. A mound had already grown over the grave, but Natalia had no intention of leaving. Why should she go somewhere? Why should she continue to live? It was too scary. She didn't see her daughter for the last time. She didn't kiss her goodbye. Only that hated coffin lid stood before her eyes. Someone hugged Natalia by the shoulders. Her neighbor Tatiana came up to take her away. "Natasha, let's go," she said quietly. "Stop tearing your heart out. Let's go to the banquet hall. We need to honor the memory of Julia." Natalia shook her head, but Tatiana persistently pulled her towards the exit. John and Samantha took 2 steps forward. They walked and quietly talked about something in English. Natalia's head suddenly cleared for a while, and she listened to the speech of those in front. "It all turned out well," John said to Samantha. "I was worried she would wake up in a coffin while her mother was screaming like crazy." "Yes, honey, everything is fine. It's all over now. No one will hear screams from underground." Natalia stopped in her tracks. She realized what her son-in-law and that girl were saying. Where did that poor woman get her strength from? She ran to John and grabbed his hand tightly. "Who will wake up in a coffin?" Natalia asked John in a broken voice in pure English. He turned pale, became noticeably nervous, and tried to break free, but Natalia tenaciously held him by the sleeve of his jacket. "What are you saying?" he asked in broken Russian. "I don't understand. You speak strangely." "How can it be?" Tatiana was standing behind them. Natalia is a foreign language teacher, no matter if she works with elementary grades. "Natasha, what are you asking John? Maybe he speaks some dialect. Let's explain it to him in Russian." Hearing Tatiana's words, John screamed wildly, jerked, broke away from Natalia, and ran to the exit. Stumbling on her high heels, Samantha rushed after him. Natalia wanted to follow them, but the next second, she stopped and turned in horror to her daughter's grave. The gravediggers had already finished their work and were silently smoking. The woman looked at the fleeing couple in confusion. "Tanya, we need to stop them," Natalia screamed in a voice not her own. "They buried my daughter alive." "Natasha, your grief is driving you completely crazy," Tatiana wailed. "My dear, calm down. Let's go to the banquet hall." "No!" Natalia growled and rushed to the grave like a tigress. She ran to the gravediggers and demanded, "Dig up the grave!" Widening their eyes, the men stared at the grief-stricken mother. Everything happened at funerals, but no one had ever gone crazy like that. "Lady, calm down," one of them said. "Your daughter is no longer there. If there is a soul, it is now flying to God." "I'll make you fly to God now," Natalia shouted, gritting her teeth. She grabbed a shovel and started throwing the ground away from the grave. At the same time, she explained what John said to Samantha. "You understand? He said he was worried about one thing, that Julia would wake up during her funeral. So she's alive. We haven't seen her dead." "No, but the document. They brought her from the city morgue. It's a reputable organization." Another man shook his head. "Don't you know people can forge documents if they have money?" Natalia answered, choking from hard work and worries. "Guys, help. Let's open the coffin. If you are scared, I will do it myself. Just help me throw away the ground. I will pay." "Well, if that's the case, let's try it." The head of the funeral team nodded, and the men took up shovels. Natalia stepped aside. She clenched her hands painfully and looked intensely at the grave. Finally, realizing what was happening, Tatiana rushed to the village men to ask them to detain John and Samantha, who had already left the cemetery in a dark SUV. And the gravediggers continued to dig up the grave. At some point, they suddenly heard a knock from below. It was as if someone was hitting the doors with their fists. Natalia heard that too. "Alive! I told you she's alive!" the woman screamed and rushed to the grave. She was ready to dig further with her hands. "Lady, go away! Let us do it!" the men shouted at her. "Guys, hurry up!" she'll choke. "My dear, I will pay you whatever you say. Please do it faster." "We don't need any money." screamed. "We are all people here. Don't cry, mother. We'll save your daughter." The men threw back the ground with such speed that probably even a tractor would be jealous. They already understood that there, underground, was a living person whom they had buried with their own hands. From realizing that horror, they worked even faster. They needed to fix their fatal mistake. Finally, the coffin lid appeared from the ground. Some movement was still inside it, but it was quieter and quieter. And then, one of the gravediggers opened the lid of the coffin. Julia was lying inside. There was no polyethylene or bleach, as it was customary to bury the bodies of those who died from the coronavirus. Disheveled and scratched, the girl was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. It was clear Julia was fighting in her grave. And then she lay motionless. One of the men felt her pulse, but there was none. The body was still warm. Natalia was right. Her daughter was buried alive. "We didn't have time," one of the gravediggers whispered bitterly. "Sorry, mother." Natalia fell at the edge of the grave and looked down at her child. "My daughter," she howled. "My dear, my sweetie, please open your eyes." It was as if nature was crying along with the mother. It started raining. The wind howled. The men got out of the grave. They were going to call the police and an ambulance. They knew there would be an investigation and didn't want to get involved. Natalia was still lying at the grave. The rain kept getting stronger. The drops hit Julia's pale face with force. The woman couldn't take her eyes off her daughter. And then a miracle happened. The girl shuddered and opened her eyes. At first, Natalia thought she had gone crazy and had hallucinations, but the girl said clearly, "Mom, is that you?" "Alive! She's alive!" Natalia screamed and almost jumped into her daughter's grave. The gravediggers stopped her. They pulled the girl from the grave. One of them took off his jacket and wrapped Julia up. Others started calling an ambulance and the police, and Natalia hugged her daughter tightly. They both were sitting at the dug grave, silent and crying from everything they had experienced. There came the villagers, who had already learned about what had happened. They took Natalia and Julia to the banquet hall, where the girl's funeral had already turned into her resurrection. Everyone tried to ask Julia something, but she was so weak, she just shook her head in response. An ambulance arrived and took the mother and daughter to the hospital. Natalia had a hypertensive crisis, and Julia could barely stand. At the hospital, they found out that the girl had a strong sedative in her blood, and it took several days for her to start speaking, walking, and just living normally. However, the detective of the local police department managed to find out the necessary information from Julia on the very first day. And that was what she said. She loved John very much and believed his every word. When his sister arrived, she accepted her as her own. 2 days ago, she returned earlier from work. Samantha and John were talking in the bathroom. Julia walked in silently and was about to shout out words of greeting when she suddenly heard fragments of their phrases. She listened. From their conversation, Julia realized Samantha and John were not brother and sister, but lovers. Coming to Russia and charming some naive fool was part of their plan. She needed to work in the company John cooperated with to conclude a not particularly significant contract. He did not intend to get married, but decided it would be even better since that fool would trust him completely. The guy chose Julia for that. John used her computer to hack the company's server and learn important information he intended to sell to their competitors. Samantha was worried her lover was not coming and decided to hurry him up. That was why she arrived. And then Julia's phone buzzed. It was some mailing. That was how she revealed herself. Samantha and John pushed her into the room. John shouted that Julia was to blame for it all. Why did she overhear their conversation? Suddenly, her beloved husband injected her with something. Julia woke up in the room. There was another man, unknown to Julia. The girl saw the man hand the ampule to John, saying he would not give the injection himself. The sedative was strong. The ampule was enough to kill. "I agreed about the death certificate and the coffin. Solve your problems yourself." He took a rather heavy envelope from John's hands and left. Her phone rang. Julia realized it was her mother calling, but she had no strength to shout anything. Samantha took the medicine into a syringe and brought it to Julia. The girl began to struggle, and part of the sedative sprayed out in a thin stream from the syringe. That probably saved Julia's life. The dosage became smaller. She woke up in a coffin. She thought it was the end. And then she saw her mother. The police detained John and Samantha the next day at the airport. They managed to give the information to the company's competitors, but it was irrelevant. The company's employees were no fools either. They assumed a hacker attack might take place and replace the files. In addition to those two, the police found the man who supplied John with the fatal medicine. He was a pathologist. He had friends at the city funeral home. They didn't ask unnecessary questions when they got large amounts of money. At night, they took unconscious Julia to the morgue. In the morning, the pathologist called Julia's mother and told her about the girl's death. The funeral home workers delivered the coffin to the village and handed it to their coliguis. They didn't care about what would happen next. The police investigated this high-profile case and then took it to court. Completely recovered, Julia and Natalia were present at the trial. Julia looked into the cage where her ex-husband was sitting and couldn't believe her eyes. Did she love that pathetic creature? It was some twist in her sobriety. The judge asked Natalia how it happened that her son-in-law didn't know she was fluent in English. Julia and I decided to surprise him. Natalia admitted. We thought they would come to visit me next time, and I would greet him in pure English. We thought it would be a good joke, and that's how it all ended. That silence saved my daughter's life. The criminals eventually received long-term prison sentences. Julia returned to work after treatment. She no longer thought about marriage, especially with a foreigner. Natalia continued to live in the village, teach children at school, and wait for her daughter to visit her on holidays. When Julia arrived, they chatted about everything, but they never talked about John, since it was too painful for both of them to remember all that horror they had experienced.